There we go. Um, so really my first question is like what your background is and like when you started writing.
Ah, um, well, I have a master's of fine arts in poetry, so that's like my creds. But I didn't write a lot of poetry in my teens or in my late childhood, but when I was a little kid, I actually used to write poetry all the time. And I had the kind of supportive hippie parents. They're musicians, but still, I can remember that my dad would type up my poems for me on a typewriter. And then I would like draw a little illustration next to it. And I actually have a couple of these that they found a few years ago. I find them highly amusing.
Have you thought about getting like a typewriter to kind of recreate that process?
I used to have a really great teal manual typewriter that I was super into, but I lost it moving
Well,
on some move or another. And nah, I don't really miss it. It was fun.
what is your writing process like?
Mm. I wouldn't say that I have one process, um, but in general, I would say that I need to do a thing that isn't writing that inspires me. So that might be gardening, it might be reading, not necessarily poetry, but often poetry. It might be like watching documentaries, like nature documentaries or history documentaries, going for a really long, slow walk. Those are the kinds of things that get me thinking in the ways that make me think about poems. And then often I'll sit down and write because I'll have a particular triggering image or a couple of words that get stuck together in my head. I almost never know where it's going to go until I'm actually writing it. And usually what comes out first is kind of just like an avalanche of blah. And then you kind of have to go through the avalanche and pick out the things that are really the poem
Yeah.
and start to shape them. I always handwrite my early drafts and then I'll type up when I'm on my maybe second or third draft, I'll type it up and see what it looks like when it looks more like a poem on a Word document page. Um, Sometimes poems happen pretty quickly for me, and sometimes they take a really long time.
Does I know that you originally went to school to be an opera singer. How does
Yes.
that impact your like writing experience or does it at all?
Being a music major was an interesting experience. A lot of my family are musicians, and I really love singing. I still love singing. I love music. It's an important part of my life, but I'm just not that extrovert. And I'm competitive. I like to win a board game, but the pressure to perform in a moment, the idea that your art hinges solely upon like this one moment, this one breath, don't blow it. That was not really a good place for me. I found that place really difficult and stressful. And it made me appreciate that I don't have to finish a poem. I can keep it to myself for 5 years, 10 years and work on other stuff. And it's only when I finally send it out there that it has to face some of that public scrutiny. It's not the immediate performance that matters. And so there's a lot more space to be private, to be insecure, to doubt, to change your mind. And I think I learned that by doing something that was really different.
That's
Does that
interesting.
make sense?
Yeah. Um, and then you mentioned that you need to have like a something like visual or like a jumble of words that like to fuel your writing. What do you do if that doesn't happen? Do you just like try to dive into a hobby that normally sparks that?
Mhm. That's a really good question. I feel like I've built up a sort of a toolkit of things that I can do. There can be that moment where you want to write, but you don't know what to write, or there can be that even worse moment where you think like, I don't even know if I want to do this, which all writers feel pretty often, but it's a bad way to feel. One of the things that I do is I will give myself a project or a really tight set of restrictions. So one of my manuscripts that I completed the last time I was on sabbatical is called The Lexicographer's Garden. And it comes out of a project I started doing in order to make myself write. And even further back than that, it started out of a project that I made my students do, an intro to poetry. I would just give them a page from the dictionary. And I would tell them that they had to write a poem using as many of the words on that page front and back as they could. And I would do it with them. It's really fun. And so I went, yeah, it's really, you should definitely try it. I went and I bought a like St. Vincent de Paul, like $3 Merriam-Webster, one of the big old ones, the hardback.
Mm-hmm.
And I tore out a page from each letter and made a stack. So I had like every letter of the alphabet. And then every Sunday morning I would get up and get up early before my husband was up and read the page and pull out some words, kind of make like a word bank at the top of the page from that I thought I wanted to use. And then I would do that exercise. I would try to write a poem that used as many of those words as possible. It was a game. It was fun. I did it twice through the entire alphabet. And then I turned it into a poetry manuscript. And I discovered that I had things to say I didn't know I wanted to talk about that came out in the pressure of that constraint. It's the opposite of sitting down with a subject.
Yeah.
Instead of sitting down with like a random collection. So your subconscious allows the subject that you didn't know you were trying to get at to come through that.
Interesting. And that one of the questions I had was, how does being a teacher impact your writing, and like the vice versa of that? And that also kind of answers that question, because
Yeah.
I guess you see what exercises you're having other people do, and then you can partake in them. One of the coolest ones that I remember from our intro to poetry class is where you made us do like pick out lines from other poems and other like articles and stuff. And that created some really cool images and stuff, trying to like push that together in a way that made sense, or made enough not sense to make sense again. So
sometimes sense isn't really the thing that we're trying to make.
Yeah. Which is a struggle when you're doing like blackout poetry and you're like, well, why doesn't this make sense? It's not supposed to. You also mentioned your sabbatical. What is that? What is that process like for a professor, and how do you come to make that decision?
So sabbatical is it's a huge privilege. Faculty who are full-time faculty at the University of Cincinnati, it works differently at different universities. Everyone's eligible to apply for sabbatical every 6 years. And you create a project proposal. For me, it was a creative proposal. The last time I took sabbatical, it was a combination of working on a particular poetry project and also totally revamping the intro to poetry class with a new textbook and a new curriculum. And a committee at your department level looks at it and decides whether it's worthy of the time, and then it goes to your dean, who kind of looks at the same thing. And if you're approved, then what it means is that you have either 1 or 2 semesters with no teaching duties and no service duties. So faculty at Claremont College, we teach 4 classes a semester roughly, depending on what our area is and how many credit hours. And that's, it's somewhere between 70 and 80% of our workload. We also serve on a lot of committees, or we do things like advise the student literary journal. And it's a break from all of those things so that you can refocus on your creative work or your research. So for someone like Professor Crome, who's a history professor, his big sabbatical project was working on a book, a critical scholarly book. Another colleague of mine is taking a sabbatical to learn how to teach history classes. They were originally a certified to teach philosophy, but they had the credit hours to teach history, and now they want to get into that, so they're going to go brush up and develop courses. So it can be any kind of creative research or pedagogy project, and you spend your time on that, and then you come back sort of refreshed and renewed with better perspectives to share with your students and your colleagues, so that you stay fresh and enthusiastic about your job.
What are your plans for your sabbatical?
Well, I'm taking a full year sabbatical. which is an option that people have, but it's half pay, so not everybody takes it. And my proposal was really just to say that I'm gonna keep writing poetry. I'm gonna finish up a couple manuscripts that I have in process. I haven't written a lot in the last couple of years. I mean, I think a lot of people, creative folks, have found the pandemic to be a difficult space in which to create. So I'm looking forward to re-nurturing that part of myself and getting back in some of those habits that I've lost a little bit the last few years. And I have a book coming out in March. So I don't have to write that book. I already wrote it, but it's good timing because it means that I'll be able to promote that book and go to readings, and hopefully it'll get some attention.
What is the publishing process like for a poet?
Yeah, it's kind of different than it is for scholarly work or even for fiction. Nobody makes money writing or publishing poetry. It's almost all done on a nonprofit basis. A lot of poetry presses are run, by folks who do them because they believe in poetry and they want to get the word out there. So a lot of presses, what they do is they run contests. People will pay $30 and send them their manuscript, and then a famous poet will read like the top 40 manuscripts and decide which one gets published. Other presses do open reading periods where their editors actually read all of the manuscripts. And that's the way my book was chosen, was through an editor's open reading period. It's very competitive. There's a lot of people writing really good poetry. And so it can be really difficult to get a book out there.
In the line of publishing, have you because I know you've published other books in the past, or have gotten things published in anthologies and stuff. Do you ever publish a poem and then read it later and wish that you could change everything about it? Or do you just not read your work once it's published?
Some people historically are really bad at this. There've been a few times where I've looked at a poem and thought, yeah, maybe I'd like to delete that line or change that word. Or sometimes when you're reading out loud, you just realize in that part of your voice that's doing that translation from page into the vocal, you automatically edit it. You find a better way to say it and you think, oh, shoot, too late. I already published it. I haven't experienced too much publication remorse. I'm pretty happy. I'm relatively picky about when I send things out. I'll wait years if I'm not sure. If I think I don't know if this is the right poem yet, then I'll just sit on it. So usually by the time I'm sending it to a journal, I feel relatively confident that it is the way I want it to be. But ask me that question again when I'm 70, Katelyn, because maybe then I'll be like, yeah, everything I published in my 30s, it was terrible.
Well, in my contemporary poetry class, we read Gwendolyn Brooks recently, who was writing a lot of very very much sonnet pieces earlier, and then kind of broke that down and started writing different stuff later.
Mhm.
And then we just read Claudia Rankine, who has very much strictly poetry broken up by lines. And then we're reading Citizen, which is essays and prose. And I just find it really interesting how writers kind of shift what they are writing, or their writing style, as they continue to write. Do you think that you've does your writing style change based on book, or do you kind of have?
I think it's what's supposed to happen, because you aren't the same person, or you shouldn't remain. If you're living your life, then your life changes you. And so your words change too, and how you see the world changes. The book of mine that's coming out in March, it's my first full-length book. And most of the poems in that book were written in my 20s and my early 30s. And I reached a point where I kind of felt almost like I didn't have this is a little too strong. I'm not sure I mean it exactly this strongly, but I didn't have the right to change the poems too much. I had to be more like an editor than the writer, because I'm not the same person I was when I was 27. Thank God. I mean, that was a fine person, but I wouldn't want to stay the same. And some of those poems are very much about being in that place and having that experience. To edit them to fit who I am now would be to write a new poem. So I ended up feeling more like either this poem is good enough as it is, or I'm taking it out completely. But I'm not going to change it too much. And I didn't feel that way about all of them, but there were a couple of them that I thought, this is a poem that's expressing a particular moment that may not be where I am now, but it was where I was then.
Yeah. I thought of a question. Where did it go? Maybe it'll come back to me. Um, you said your book comes out in March. Is that March, like March of 2023?
It is.
Um, how long do you think it took you to kind of like get it to a place that you thought it was good enough to send to a publisher?
There is no simple answer to that question. I finished the manuscript. It took some pieces of work I did as an MFA student, and then work that I created for maybe the 8 years after that. And there was the first time I thought it was ready and started sending it out, and then it was a finalist in a few places, which is great. It was very encouraging. But it didn't get published. So then there was a point at which I said, okay, now how am I going to change it? And I added some things and subtracted some things and edited some things. And that happened over a period of like 10 years, honestly, as I was continuing to write other things and publish other things. So I probably thought it was finished at least 3 or 4 times. And it's still not finished. I mean, the process now is that I sent a revised draft to my editor, who's then going to come back to me with edits. So it'll change yet again before it comes out in March.
Is there like a central theme of the book, or was it like how do you fit together your work into like what you would consider a book of poetry?
Yeah, it's pretty easy to explain, say like The Lexicographer's Garden. I can tell you like that's a book where I wrote a poem about a page from the dictionary every day. It's a nice nutshell. This book, it's called Helen of Bikini, after a bomb named Helen that was detonated at Bikini Atoll during the atom bomb tests. And it's not all concerned with issues of 20th century environmental disaster, but like that's the thread that kind of winds through it, is the short-sightedness or the mistakes that humans make out of fear, out of ignorance, and what it's like to try and look back and understand moments in history that maybe we wish we could have done something different, but we can't.
Is in the process of that, is there anything that like you read it and you were like, this is too personal, and you're like, you don't put it in? Like, where do you draw the line for like personal?
I'm not a highly confessional poet. I already have a fairly firm filter. I respect poets who write really honestly and confessionally. As I joke with my parents, I had a disturbingly normal childhood. So it may also be that I'm not impelled by that confessional need because I don't usually write out of personal trauma. That's not one of my wells. So it's not often an issue for me. I'm not usually moved to write about things that I would then worry, well, what if so and so read this, or what if this was on the internet and everyone could see it? And that's a real serious issue for a lot of poets, and I'm not sure how they navigate that. I have occasionally written something where I've thought like, I don't know, that might cut a little close to the bone. I think if you want to be honest as an artist, you have to sometimes take that risk.
I would definitely agree.
Yeah.
Kind of moving away from the publishing, I know that you have gone to writing residencies in the past. What do those look like, and do they kind of vary by like what type of residency it is?
Oh yeah, there's the wildly different. So the idea of a residency is that either in solitude or with a bunch of other folks, and sometimes all writers, but sometimes also visual artists, composers, whatever it is, it creates a space that's away from your everyday life, that's supposed to help you focus on your art. When I was on sabbatical last time, I did two residencies. I went to the Sundress Farms in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I went to the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts in Virginia, in Amherst, Virginia, near Sweetbriar College. And they were completely different experiences, and they were both really great. At Sundress Farms, it's just an old farmhouse in a holler, and there's only two people there, a permanent resident and me, the person who comes through and stays for a couple weeks. And you actually do farm work. You go get eggs from the chickens and throw hay down for the sheep. And it worked really well for me because I really liked the other writer, Emily Captini, who was there, and spending time with her was really neat. And I learned that I'm too weak to pick up a bale of hay without serious effort. You have no idea how heavy those things are. So it was fun. It was an adventure. VCCA is more like, I think, what people imagine a residency is. Like, you have a bedroom, and then you walk out to your studio, which in this case, the studios are built in a big old barn. And you go to basically like a cafeteria, and you have breakfast made for you, and you have dinner with all the other artists. It's very communal. I loved so much being around other artists and hearing about their process and hearing about their struggles. And I found that to be incredibly invigorating, because when you listen to somebody else talk about why they do what they do, or you watch them and you see their process, I think it gives you permission to do your thing a little bit more. And so it's a gift. It's a real gift. If you ever have a chance to do it, if you're ever like, hey, here's a residency for, undergrad students, then you should do it. It gives you permission. It says, you know what, for these 3 weeks, your job is to sit at a desk and work on your poems. I mean, when does the world give that to you?
Yeah. Often
we have to write in spite of our pressures and our jobs, and people saying to us, why are you're doing that again? This is a space where you come together and people say, oh, what'd you write about today?
Are you required to have like a certain output by time you leave? Or like, if you write a poem, do you have to like dedicate like a part of your book to the residency at all?
Most residencies will just ask, that you put something in your acknowledgements page that says, some of this work was completed with the assistance of time at, or something like that, which I think most of us would do anyway, because we're grateful to have had it. But most places are pretty clear. This is not about product. It's not about, do you have something shiny at the end? A lot of people do go because they're close to the finish line, especially fiction writers. Because when you're looking at that big picture, that undisturbed time is especially useful. So people do often go with a specific goal in mind. But when I went to VCCA, I had a specific goal in mind, and that I didn't accomplish it. I kept getting distracted by this other writing project, and I was getting really mad. And finally, one night at dinner, a fiction writer friend of mine, Pedro, said, "What? This sounds like a cool project. Why are you so mad at yourself? Just do it. Nobody cares what you're working on here." And I needed that permission, and I went and I worked on it, and it wasn't at all the plan I had submitted.
Have you ever written fiction or
no.
dabbled in any other writing forms?
I love reading fiction, and the few times I tried to write it, it was like I don't know, it was like trying on the wrong body. It wasn't right. So I admire fiction, and I admire people whose attention spans are big enough to write fiction, but it's not for me.
What are you reading right now? Do you have a favorite book right now?
About a year ago, I started reading science fiction again. And it's a genre that I come back to in moments of stress. It's comforting. And I have just been devouring over the last year or so. I like really ambitious works. There's this Chinese author whose name I cannot remember right now, who wrote this novel called The Three Body Problem. And it's this highly complex work of science fiction that's really grounded in science. Like, some science fiction is just fantasy, but with spaceships, right? And that's okay. I like that too. But it's hard sci-fi. And it imagines what would happen to sort of the collective human psyche if we realized we weren't alone in the universe, but in a really dark way, not in like a Star Trek Vulcans, everybody's going to love each other way. And it's a trilogy. And I was reading that a couple of months ago, and I liked it because it was realistic about human nature, um, and wildly imaginative. So I think that's what I like about good science fiction. Like Neil Stephenson is another one of my favorites, and Becky Chambers, who's totally different than Neil Stephenson. I admired just sort of the wild imagination. What was the last poetry book I read? Oh, sorry, all the pop-ups. I haven't been reading as much poetry as I would like to the last year. In that same way that I think a lot of us have been having a hard time paying attention to the things we know we value in life because we're tired.
Yeah.
So one of my goals for sabbatical is to just get up in the morning and sit down with a book of poems for 20 minutes. I'm looking forward to that.
Who are your main like poetic influences, or like that like you go back to reading their poems all the time?
In the last 5 years, the book that's had the biggest impact on me is Catalog of Unabashed Gratitude by Ross Gay. It's a beautiful book. It's a book that deals with grief and loss and joy and gardening. And I read it as a fellow gardener, even before I read it as a fellow poet. And that's the book that I keep giving people as Christmas presents or birthday presents. I'm like, you have to read this book. And I also read about a year ago a book by a trans author named Joss Charles called Field, but it's spelled F-E-E-L-D. And that book like turned me upside down and shook me around. So those are some recent ones. But if you go way back, it was like whatever I could find in the public library, and I would pull stuff off the shelf and read a little. And if it hooked me, I would take it home. And if it didn't, I would put it back. And so from that, it was very much Rainer Maria Rilke, William Stafford, Mary Oliver. Those were some of the early poet voices that I was really attracted to. And then James Wright and Sylvia Plath. People can make jokes about Plath all they want, but they only do it because they can't write as well as she does. I mean, she's just the queen. It's just beautiful writing. And I think one of my favorite things to do is to read a book written by somebody I know. Maybe somebody who it's their first book and I saw them wait for it to happen and it's finally out there in the world. That's one of my favorite things. I really like that.
You mentioned Josh Charles, and I read parts of Field recently. And how much of that did you have to like, I mean, poetry should be read aloud most times anyway, but how much of that did you really have to like read aloud to like
I probably didn't do that as much as I should have. But I did definitely. And then for the first couple of pages, I felt so intensely uncomfortable. Like I'm not going to be able to read a whole book with this sort of alternate spelling. And then I sort of slid into it. Like when you get in a pool that's too cold and you think you'll never get used to it. And then you do.
Yeah. It was definitely very like phonetically written and not like it was very interesting, and I had never heard of Josh Charles before I read it, but it was definitely intrigued.
I saw that they have a new book that's just coming out and I'm super excited about it. It's sort of like reading, I took a class in Brit Lit that went way back to like Middle English and some of the Old English. And, spelling wasn't standardized until really recently.
Yeah.
So if you read Chaucer in the original, you can kind of figure out what he's saying, and it's in that same way. And I like that the Field reminds us that maybe standardizing things is a recent trend and maybe we should undo it.
One of the last questions that I have written down is, do you ever see yourself getting a doctorate?
No. That was what I thought I wanted to do when I got my master's degree in literature. And I really enjoyed getting my master's degree in literature. I love taking literature classes. But that degree wasn't about being a writer. It was about being a scholar, which is a really wonderful thing to do. But it wasn't the thing that I wanted to do. And so when I chose to leave that program and I applied to the MFA at Sarah Lawrence, that was a deliberate decision to step away from that particular academic track. And then I saw my husband live through it, and I definitely didn't want to do it after that. You have to, I mean, it's a worthy thing, but it is a difficult journey.
Yeah.
There's a reason that there aren't that many people with PhDs. It is an unbelievable commitment and a very serious amount of work.
I can't imagine being in school that long, even.
Yeah.
Let me make sure I got everything.
Here's what I do want to do, Katelyn.
Yeah.
I want to retire with my mind still functional, and then I want to just randomly take classes and whatever I feel like learning about. Not with the rigor and the program and the focus on one specific thing like a PhD, but like, you know what, this semester I'm going to take a botany class.
Yeah.
What, this semester I'm going to take ceramics. This semester I think I'm going to take astronomy. That kind of insane
I feel like
privilege.
doing that too, like, would inspire a lot of like random poems.
It would.
Like,
it totally would. Part of my degree requirement at Sarah Lawrence was to take at least 2 classes that were outside of the writing department.
yeah.
And I took a class in biodiversity, and I took a class in women's studies and women's history. And working with those, they were amazing professors. Working with those professors and doing that reading in those areas was at least as much a part of why I loved that program as any of the other stuff. It was so much fun.
Is there anything that you're gonna miss while you're on sabbatical?
Oh yeah, it's going to be really weird. I mean, I love working with students. So not being around my students for a whole year is going to feel really weird. I don't know that I'll miss grading papers, but I will definitely miss, and it'll be strange to come back, and also comforting to come back and see that the world has continued to turn without me.
That's all I had written down. Is there anything that you feel that we didn't get to that you like, book wise, or anything that you want to plug?
Book-wise. Well, let's assume that folks who are watching this, a lot of folks might be Claremont College students. Our college has the best collection of poetry books up on the 2nd floor of the library. It's usually how I go pick out new books of poetry to read. Of course, I also ask them to buy things, so I know what's up there. We're really lucky. We have a collection that rivals main campus library's collection, and you can just go up and pull stuff off the shelf. And if you're feeling uninspired or stuck or down, going and pulling off a book of poetry from the shelf and sitting down with it can be a pretty good remedy for that.
Yeah.
It works for me.
Thank you for doing the interview. I think it'll be a nice addition to have the current but leaving staff advisor giving some perspectives on writing.
Well, thanks for asking me. It was a lot of fun. There's no writer ever, pretty much ever anywhere, who would turn down the chance to talk about their work.
Yeah. Oh, I thought of one more question before we leave.
Yeah.
What is the process for you to pick like the visiting poet?
Oh, that's a good question. There are a couple of different ways that can happen. Sometimes I invite people who came here in the past who are really good, who really connected with the students and everybody had a positive experience. But I really like to invite people who have their first book, because it can be really difficult to find an audience for a first book of poems. And so I will often keep my eye out. It has to be somebody who can get here. So it usually tends to be somebody in a sort of a 3 or 4 hour drive radius, unless they know somebody or they're already coming through town and they, If I know them well enough, I'll say, I know you're coming from Chicago, but you can stay in my guest bedroom. Sometimes people ask, especially local folks, they'll say, I have a book coming out. Could I come out and read? And sometimes that'll work out. And one of our poets this year I invited because he was published by Dr. Kim Jacobs Beck's press, and I wanted to support her press and the authors that she's publishing. Um, so those are some of the reasons. I mean, I kind of have like total power to pick who I want,
Yeah.
but I try not to abuse the privilege. I want to get a variety of voices, right? I want to get people at different parts in their career, different life experiences, different backgrounds. Yeah.